Welcome to Chapter 1. This chapter is titled An Invitation to Personal Learning and Growth, and that is exactly what I would like to invite you to do in this course. So this is kind of an overview as to what this course is all about, the purpose of it, and hopefully what you'll get out of it. So let's go ahead and get started. In my other classes, I often tell my students that I wish when we were in elementary or middle school, we were all required to take a class about our emotions. And in that class, we would learn how to control our emotions, how to cope with our emotions, how to better understand them. Because I think so many of us are never given emotional tools or taught anything about emotions, and we don't understand how much they influence our thoughts and our behavior and just our general perspective on life. So this class is kind of that class in a way. I think that we are so used to having these emotions and buying into them and defending them in the same way that we have thoughts and we feel we have to defend our thoughts. But our behaviors and our thoughts, they can all be fleeting. They can all change. They come, they go. We don't have to totally buy into them. We don't have to let them define us, because ultimately we're just people that were born into this existence on a planet in a country, and in that specific country there's a society and a culture, and then we are in a family and we start to create an identity to try to make sense of all of this, and then we develop an ego to kind of defend that identity. So this class is all about examining that identity, but to do so, to gain that self-awareness, you kind of have to shed that ego a little bit and fight past those defenses that we set up to protect our identity and our thoughts and our feelings. And so the idea is that if we can do what Socrates is suggesting here, which is to examine our life, then we can gain a sense of awareness about both our relationship with ourself, so our personal awareness, and our relationship with others, so our social awareness. And hopefully through that awareness, we can be happier, healthier people who are awake and aware and honest with ourselves. And so those are sort of the purposes of this class, to gain some self-awareness. And to do so, we're going to have to shed our ego. And we're going to have to identify, what are my habits of thought? What are my habits of emotion? What are my habits of behavior? And are those things serving me? And if they're not, then the good news is that you have a choice and you can change. As a psychologist, people often ask me if people can change, and it is a resounding yes. If people want to change and really put in the effort, they can. But it's difficult. It's very difficult to change. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of time. But hopefully this class will give you the tools to change what you feel like you need to change in order to grow as a person and be the best version of you that you can be. So I've just kind of made the argument that one of the reasons to take this course and to look inside yourself and consider changing to help you grow as a person is so that you can be happier. So let's take a look at that concept and that idea and just kind of look at what research says brings us happiness. And we can start by talking about what doesn't necessarily bring us happiness. So a lot of people in our culture, especially in the Western civilization or in the Western culture, have been led to believe that money will buy happiness, and that in order to be happy, you need to produce and consume. And the more stuff you have, the more material you have in the external world, that somehow that's going to change your internal world and make you happier. So let's take a look at a video and see what research shows us about the relationship between money and happiness.
Imagine winning a multi-million-dollar lottery tomorrow. If you're like many of us, you'd be ecstatic, unable to believe your good luck. But would that joy still be there a few years later? Maybe not. A famous study of 22 lottery winners showed that months after winning, their average reported levels of happiness had increased no more than that of a control group who hadn't won the lottery. Some were actually unhappier than they had been before winning. And later studies have confirmed that our emotional well-being, how often and how intensely we feel things like joy, sorrow, anxiety, or anger, don't seem to improve with wealth or status beyond a certain point. This has to do with a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation, or the hedonic treadmill. It describes our tendency to adapt to new situations to maintain a stable emotional equilibrium. When it comes to feeling happy, most of us seem to have a base level that stays more or less constant throughout our existence. Of course, the novelty of better food, superior vacations, and more beautiful homes can at first make you feel like you're walking on air. But as you get used to those things, you revert to your default emotional state. That might sound pretty gloomy, but hedonic adaptation makes us less emotionally sensitive to any kind of change, including negative ones. The study with the lottery winners also looked at people who had suffered an accident that left them paralyzed. When asked several months after their accidents how happy they were, they reported levels of happiness approaching their original baseline. So while the hedonic treadmill may inhibit our enjoyment of positive changes, it seems to also enable our resilience in recovering from adversity. There are other reasons that winning the lottery may not make us happier in the long run. It can be difficult to manage large sums of money, and some lottery winners wind up spending or losing it all quickly. It can also be socially isolating. Some winners experience a deluge of unwelcome requests for money, so they wind up cutting themselves off from others. And wealth may actually make us meaner. In one study, participants played a rigged game of Monopoly, where the experimenters made some players rich quickly. The wealthy players started patronizing the poorer players and hogging the snacks they were meant to share. But just because a huge influx of cash isn't guaranteed to bring joy into your life, doesn't mean that money can never make us happier. Findings show that we adapt to extrinsic and material things, like a new car or a bigger house, much faster than we do to novel experiences, like visiting a new place or learning a new skill. So by that reasoning, the more you spend money on experiences rather than things, the happier you'd be. And there's another way to turn your money into happiness. Spend it on other people. In one study, participants were given some money and were either asked to spend it on themselves or on someone else. Later that evening, researchers called up these participants and asked them how happy they were. The happiness levels of those who had spent the money on others were significantly greater than that of those who had spent it on themselves. And that seems to be true around the world. Another study examined the generosity of over 200,000 people from 136 countries. In over 90% of these countries, people who donated tended to be happier than those who didn't. But this all may be easier said than done. Let's say $1 million falls into your lap tomorrow. What do you do with it?
So essentially what researchers found then is that there is a certain amount of money that you basically need to live off of. And in America, the last reports that I read were about $50,000 a person. And in our state of California, if you live in California, it's a little bit higher because it's a little bit more expensive to live here. So about $70,000 is the amount of money that you need to have all your basic needs met, to be able to pay all your bills, to be able to buy a little extra stuff here and there, get your nails done, get clothes when you need them, take care of your kids, pay for their extracurriculars, your groceries and all your food, and being able to eat out, entertainment, all of that. So all of those kind of basic needs and a little bit extra is covered under those incomes, so 50 to or 70,000 depending on where you live. But research shows that after that, there's really not any additional amount of money that's going to make us any happier. So kind of the thought is, if $50,000 makes me happy, then $500,000 is going to make me ecstatic, and that's just not what happiness research shows. It just shows that once you have your needs met, no additional amount of money is going to make you any happier. In fact, additional amounts of money tend to actually bring people stress. So factors that are important to happiness are love and relationship satisfaction, having work that is meaningful and gives you a sense of purpose. A lot of college students that I talk to tell me that they're just going to college to get a high paying job. And I can relate to that because when I was in college, that's the reason I was going, was to make a good amount of money. And it was something that was very important to me in my early adulthood for a long time. But then, you start to kind of look into that idea and you start to talk to people, and you realize that there's so many people that went for a job because of the money that they would make, and then ended up leaving that job or being very depressed or alcoholics, or having addiction issues or relationship issues because that job wasn't serving them. It wasn't making them happy. It wasn't giving them meaning and purpose. And so in a lot of scenarios, people will leave a very high paying job to do something that pays less, like becoming a teacher, for example, but fulfills them more and gives them a sense of purpose. Another factor that's very important to happiness is our genetics. So we actually have like a happiness set point. When we come into the world, some of us are a little bit happier than others, or at least that's how we're wired to be. But of course, the environment that you are in really dictates where your happiness is going to go from there. So we're kind of set up to come into the world with a certain level of happiness, but then our environment moderates that. And then also, personality is very important to happiness. So we'll talk in this course about things like the hardy personality, which are just like very resilient people who have a positive outlook on life. And then we'll talk about optimism, which is another personality trait that's associated with high levels of happiness. Factors that are somewhat important to happiness include health. Having good health or relatively good health indicates or is predictive of um, happiness. Social relations, so having interactions with other people that are gratifying. Leisure activity, so downtime, being able to relax. Culture, the culture in which you exist and identify with, can play a big role on your happiness, especially if it does or doesn't kind of sync up with your personality or your ideology. Religion is somewhat important to happiness. So if you subscribe to a particular religion and you feel like you get a lot of meaning out of that and have good social networks within that religious organization, then that can increase happiness. And of course, if your religion is maybe making you feel guilt or shame or doubt or fear, then you'd have like an inverse relationship with happiness. And then factors that are relatively unimportant to happiness, money. Like we said, research shows that once you have enough money to live comfortably, excess money just adds stress and doesn't increase happiness. And then age is relatively unimportant to happiness. Gender, so males don't tend to be happier than females or vice versa. And then parenthood doesn't seem to have much of an impact on happiness. People, if they were unhappy prior to having kids, tend to be unhappy after having kids. And if they're happy prior to having kids, they're happy after having kids. Intelligence doesn't seem to really play a role in happiness. So how smart you are won't necessarily increase your happiness. And then physical appearance, which I personally find is a comforting thing, because we all have days where we look in the mirror and aren't super excited about our physical appearance. But research shows that, even if you get a ton of plastic surgery or get the latest outfit or shoes or handbag or hairstyle or whatever, actually that stuff doesn't tend to increase a person's happiness. So what does increase a person's happiness? What will bring us a happy life? What can we do? So, one of the things that we can do is focus on the positive aspects of life, have an attitude of gratitude, kind of look around and be thankful for the things that you have. Really minor things that we probably take for granted, like thumbs or air conditioning, instead of focusing on what you don't have or what's unfair or anything that's kind of negative. If you can focus on the positive, it's one thing you can do to increase your happiness. Another thing that we've already kind of touched on is maintain an optimistic perspective. So there's lots of like little sayings that you can tell yourself to help you achieve an optimistic perspective. Like everything happens for a reason, which isn't necessarily my favorite saying, but it comes in handy from time to time. This too shall pass. Did I care? Do I remember the things that I was anxious or worried about a year ago? Probably not. So, how worried do I need to be about this particular thing? You can kind of Google Earth it, as I like to say, which is to zoom out on the importance of your life, which it can sound kind of dark, but I think some people might find it actually kind of comforting in that, we're just like a blip in time and we're just these tiny dots floating on a giant rock through infinite dark space. So if Judy is mad at us for, a day, how awful is that really, or how important is that really? So maintain an optimistic perspective, live in the present, live in the moment. So you can't change your past. You can't, there's really no reason to worry about it because worrying about it's not going to change anything. And focusing on the future can kind of be a fruitless activity also because you don't really know what the future is going to bring necessarily, what kind of curveballs it's going to throw you, or if you are even guaranteed a future. I know that's pretty dark, but those are just reasons to stay in the present moment. Just experience the here and now. Life is relatively short, and so if we spend all our time in the past, which is just a memory, or in the future, which is just a dream, then we're not really living in reality, which is what's happening right now. Another important aspect of happiness is to be around people that we love and that we feel loved by. We're as humans, we're social creatures, and we're wired to need a sense of community and need people around us and need validation, and we really get that need met when we spend quality time with those that we love, and it causes our brains to release chemicals that feel good: oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. It's good for our physical and mental health. Another thing that you want to do is forgive those who have hurt you. It's really important that you kind of take away the power they have over you, by the pain that they're causing you or that they have caused you. And it's kind of the higher space to be in to forgive someone. Maybe they don't necessarily deserve your forgiveness, but we're all here on earth just trying to do our best, and people make mistakes, and carrying that burden of the pain that someone else has caused you doesn't really serve you in any way. And then finally, figure out what you love to do, and then do that thing as much as you can. What's that thing that when you start doing it, you really get in what some psychologists call the flow, where you forget to eat and you forget to go to the bathroom, and time just seems to disappear when you're painting or when you're reading or when you're writing, or whatever that thing is that gets you in that flow, that kind of takes you out of this time and space and just completely fulfills all of your needs. Figure out what that thing is and do that, regardless of how little it pays or how much it pays or what people say about the possibility of you actually achieving that or not achieving that. Go for it. And even if it's not a way that you make a living, make sure you work it into your life as a hobby or a leisure activity or something. Because if we're not doing what fulfills us, then of course we're never going to be able to be happy. Self-control is another thing that's closely related to happiness, but it's kind of a fruitless activity to try to control everything, because there's so much that we can't control. within our environment and within ourselves even. So what we want to try to do is control the things that we can, control the controllables, which usually is our reaction to other people or our reactions to our emotions or our thoughts. And what we can't control, just kind of accept that that's part of life, that we can't control everything. And so a big part of happiness is knowing when to let go. But being able to have some type of self control over like your emotional reactivity and regulation and things like that is a major part of self esteem. So, self esteem is a positive view of oneself and a sense of confidence and self worth. So, one of the things that you can do to increase your self esteem, which actually sounds kind of counterintuitive, is to take responsibility for how you treat other people. Our connection with others is imperative to our own self esteem and it's imperative to our own happiness. So we can term this other esteem, which is respecting, accepting, caring, valuing, and promoting others without reservation. And your ability to do those things kind of constitutes your esteem with other people. So, research shows that charitable acts actually increase physical and mental well being. So, random acts of kindness, or even that research that we were looking at earlier on the relationship between money and happiness, says that when people have excess money, what they do with it is a really important factor in how happy it will make them. And one of the best things people can do with money to increase their happiness is to give it to others. So while it's important to be charitable and be loving and empathetic towards other people, there also needs to be a balance between caring for others and caring for yourself. So you have to also take care of yourself and make sure that you're not being taken advantage of or walked all over. But you also want to shed your ego and be willing to give and be generous and be empathetic and not be so self absorbed. But in order to connect with others, you also need self love and you need self awareness. So lots of people say they want personal growth. They buy like self help books and go to meditation retreats and stuff. But the truth is that a lot of people actually avoid personal growth when it comes down to it. And so, what are some of the reasons that people may do this? One of the major reasons is fear. Fear of what you're going to find out about yourself. You know, a lot of us exist in our ego. We think our ego is our real self. And so we have our defense walls up really high and we lie to ourselves. We convince ourselves we're something that we're not. And so um, becoming more self aware means really looking at who you are, the real you, and being vulnerable and putting down those walls. And that can be really scary. Changing means taking greater responsibility for your life and for your choices. When you are working on your own personal growth, there's a part of that that means you have to stop blaming other people or other circumstances or fate or God or whatever for the outcomes in your life and take control of what you can control and change what you can change, what's not working for you. And then, of course, you know, other people may be resistant to your growth, people in your life, friends, family. Part of that is because if they're miserable, there's that old saying that misery loves company. And people may fear that your change will make them look bad, or I guess even worse, inspire them to look inward at their true selves as well. There's also, you know, complacency. We're like, oh, my life's not that bad. You know, it could be better, but it's not that bad. And change takes a lot of work and effort. And so some of us are maybe too lazy to change. It may be easier to just let other people make decisions for us. It may be easier to blame external forces, other people, certain situations for the things in our life that aren't going the way we want them to go. And then finally, your culture can affect your personal growth. Maybe you have cultural traditions or ideologies. And part of becoming self aware will include looking at those traditions and ideologies and seeing if they actually serve you. And that can be a scary thing, and people around you that are part of that culture might not like that. And maybe some of the things in your culture don't necessarily line up with the person that you want to become, and that can be a tough thing to deal with. One of the interesting things about change that maybe is not so commonsensical is that in order to change, you actually have to accept the person that you are right now. And we call this the paradoxical theory of change, which is the theory that personal change tends to occur when we become aware of what we are as opposed to trying to become what we are not. So, figuring out who you are is really the starting point for change. And to do this, you need to not be in denial. If all signs point to an anger issue, don't ignore that and decide you need to work on being strong, aggressive, and confrontational. Uh, don't be overly critical. If you're not kind to yourself, you won't be successful. So, you need to grow for the right reasons. Grow for self-love, grow for a better version of yourself, and don't be mad at the person that you are currently. All of uh, your decisions and your habits of thinking and feeling and thought have all led you to this moment right now. And those things don't define you, but they've helped to get you here today. And so now maybe it's time to start kind of tweaking things a little bit and making adjustments where necessary. But the things that you've been doing that haven't necessarily been helpful to your life, they don't make you a bad person or define you in any way. So don't be overly critical, because that can actually kind of be detrimental in the process and make you want to give up. The next thing is self-exploration. So you have to really be honest with yourself if you're going to change or grow at all, or even just become more self-aware. And so you'll have to make some commitments. You'll have to believe in yourself. All of this actually takes a lot of effort. It's very difficult to change something. So the definition of self-exploration is being honest with yourself and others, thinking for yourself, and making a commitment to live by your choices. And one thing that you can do also is be aware of risks. There's risks throughout this process. You may find out that there are things you don't like about yourself, or things you don't like about your situations. And so you need to kind of go at this delicately and gently, and ask yourself if you are in a place emotionally where you can handle some of the risks that you might encounter, some of the negative things that might come up. Change is a difficult thing to do. In fact, researchers have tried to figure out just why it's so difficult. And in an effort to do that, they kind of broke down the stages of behavior change. And so we're going to talk about the stages of change, the theory. And it is a framework that describes 5 identifiable stages of change. The first stage is pre-contemplation. And this is when the person really has no intention of changing a maladaptive behavior, a bad behavior, anytime soon. The next one is contemplation, and this is where the person becomes aware that a problem exists and thinks about changing that behavior, but is not really fully committed to doing so. The next stage is preparation, and this is when a person starts talking about change and is planning to do so. They may even start making some small changes or steps towards change. The next stage is action, and this is actively taking steps and making specific behavioral choices to change. And then finally, after the change has occurred, we go into the maintenance stage, where we work to maintain the newly improved behavior and prevent relapse. It's not really common to pass through the stages in perfect order. People go through a couple stages and then revert back to an earlier stage. They have doubt in the process and step away from change altogether for a little bit and then come back. So they give up, they re-engage, they skip ahead a couple steps because they get enthusiastic about the process, and then they can become stressed or overwhelmed. So it's not just like a linear process to go through these 5 stages of change, but they are the stages that we see as a person is changing. So let's watch a video that goes more into detail on this theory of the stages of behavioral change.
The first stage that's discussed in this model is the stage of pre-contemplation. In pre-contemplation, we're typically dominated by denial of having any problem. Let me ask you, who has never found him or herself in need of some fundamental change. It could be in a behavior or an attitude. And often at this stage, it comes to our attention because somebody else is alarmed or concerned. And yet, we ourselves might at that moment have zero willingness or even capacity to acknowledge that there is, in fact, a problem. This would be an example of pre-contemplation. It signifies that I'm not even ready yet to contemplate any kind of change in my life because there's not a problem really. The second stage represents the shift to acknowledging that we do have a problem, and this is, as you might imagine, this is referred to as contemplation. And even though there's an acknowledgement here of there being a problem, there's not yet necessarily the willingness to actually change. That comes later. So typically, even though there's an acknowledgement of there being a problem, there's oftentimes a huge amount of ambivalence about the idea of changing at all. That moves us towards the third stage, and that's preparation. Here now, there's the beginning of an inner determination to change. The problem is on the table. The key issue here is initiating a plan or a strategy for making positive change. The fourth stage, then, is action. This is where change is actually put into action. It can be a very heady time where hopes run high. Sometimes in the recovery literature, it's referred to as the pink cloud, the time of great excitement because there's movement. I have to say also, this can also be a time where it risks the feeling of being overwhelmed. Once the addict in recovery realizes the immensity of what he or she is up against, it can be quite ominous. Once action has been taken and let's say the addictive behaviors have remitted, at least for a time, then we're into the next stage, which would be the fifth stage or the maintenance stage. Here the focus is on sustaining or maintaining sobriety. This is the period of time in which the strategies might be focused on managing triggers, various triggers to addiction, even learning from possible relapses. Let me say a word about relapse. In this stage of maintenance, relapse may invite the reinstitution of previous stages, going back and redoing the previous stages and getting the addict back on track. Hopefully, in the spirit of our conversation about circles and spirals, hopefully the addict is back on track, maybe a bit wiser now and just a bit further up the spiral, let's say, in terms of self-awareness and resilience to future stressors. Thank you.
Created using Powtoon. We use the words adjustment and growth a lot in this class, so let's make sure we have a clear definition or delineation of the two. Growth is actually kind of the more appropriate term to use, but let's start by talking about adjustment. So adjustment is a psychological process through which an individual copes with the demands and challenges of daily life. It's a norm by which people can kind of assess their level of mental health, like how well adjusted is this person. Some of the problems with that term is that it implies that there is a universal standard for adjustment. So when we say how well is someone adjusted to their environment, that does imply that there's like a point at which you can get at where you're well adjusted. And who gets to determine where that point is? Who gets to determine if a person is adjusted because who defines good standards of adjustment or what the norms for adjustment are? And then, of course, like we can't expect people to adjust to destructive environments, and really people shouldn't adjust to being like abused at home or sexually harassed at work. And so kind of saying like, oh, someone isn't well adjusted at home might be like kind of negatively reflecting on that person, when actually what that person's doing is a very healthy thing by not adjusting to being abused at home. And then what is considered well-adjusted in one culture may not be viable in another culture. So the book tries to focus more on using the term growth. So to define personal growth, it's a lifelong process of positive changes rather than a fixed point at which we arrive, like adjustment would suggest. It's continual. It doesn't stop to be measured. It includes the idea that culture and context are essential in the process, and it gives you the power to decide what norms and standards you want to set for yourself. It puts you in control more so than that term adjustment, or thinking of this process as being an adjustment, does. One of the things that we can do to kind of gauge where we are at right now in a personal growth process is to take what's called the Personal Growth Initiative. And it is something that hopefully will trigger optimal functioning and well being, but it includes analyzing the following factors. How ready to change are you? Do you have the ability to plan specific changes? Can you use resources throughout the growth process to help you change and develop and grow? And then the last factor that it's going to assess is, are you willing and able to engage in intentional behavior that will assist in the process of personal growth? So, are you willing to take action to actually make some changes? So, this is going to be our very first lecture activity. So what you will want to do is open up a Word document and go ahead and save this file as Chapter 1 Lecture Activities. And then within the document itself, go ahead and put number 1 for the first lecture activity, and then title that PGI for Personal Growth Initiative. And then I'm going to put up the survey on the screen, so you might want to go ahead and pause the screen and then take the survey. And to take the survey, you're just going to answer the questions by indicating if you strongly disagree or strongly agree, or where you fall in that continuum. So your answers will just be numbers. And then once you finish taking the survey, you'll want to go ahead and press play on the video, and then do what it says on the slide here for scoring. So add up all the numbers that you circled, or in this case, all the numbers that you wrote down, and then divide by 9, and you should get a score between 1 and 6, and that should give you an indication of how motivated and ready to change you are. So lower numbers might indicate that right now in this moment you're not super motivated to change, and then higher numbers are that you are absolutely ready. Either way, it doesn't really matter. It's just a way to kind of gauge where you're at right now in this moment. Okay, here's the survey. Okay, great. So now that you've taken the survey, go ahead and score it up like we talked about before. And then on that document, write down what your final score was. And just tell me if you agree or disagree with that score, in terms of it indicating how motivated or ready to change you are. And give me a couple sentences on why you agree or why you disagree, just like 1 or 2 sentences. And that will be the first lecture activity for this chapter. There'll be more. So save that file and have it readily accessible. Maybe save it to your desktop or something. You'll be opening it again through this lecture and adding to it. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the main theories and psychological ideas behind what we're going to be talking about in this course. So we're going to look at some of the major psychologists who have studied their whole lives on what personal growth is and how to initiate and be successful at it. And so the perspective on personal growth really comes from what we call humanistic psychology. So humanistic psychology is a perspective in psychology. There are several perspectives. There's the cognitive perspective, the psychodynamic perspective, which comes from Sigmund Freud. There's the behavioral perspective, which comes from famous psychologists like Pavlov and Watson, if you've heard of them. If not, it doesn't matter. But anyways, this is the humanistic perspective, and this perspective basically believes that all people are good inside, and that we all have this potential to be the best versions of ourselves, and we have a innate motivation to become the best version of ourselves. And so in order to do that, we need to have self awareness and self love and all of these kind of hippy dippy ideas that I personally really like. Humanistic psychology, by definition, is an approach to the study of personal growth based on an actualizing model of what humans can become. And so the core concept of humanistic psychology is self actualization. And so self actualization is an effort to reach your full potential. And humanistic psychologists believe that we all have this natural self actualizing tendency, which causes us to work towards fulfilling our potential and becoming all that we are capable of being. Um, However, striving for growth is not like an automatic process. It involves turmoil, it's tough, it takes a long time. Humanistic psychologists argue that very few people actually ever become self-actualized, but we all have kind of this desire to get there. But it is a journey, and it does take time, and really the process is what's important, not necessarily the end goal, because so few people actually ever are fully self-actualized. So, a more contemporary version of humanistic psychology, or a newer kind of field of psychology that is built on the tenets of humanistic ideologies, is called positive psychology. And it really was kind of started in 2011 by a guy named Martin Seligman. And he aims to help people flourish by focusing on positive aspects of life, and it's really popular right now. So let's watch a video of the founder of positive psychology explaining what it is.
Psychologists told us a lot about misery and suffering and drug addiction and schizophrenia, but there's a way in which that's just half-baked. I mean, a full-baked, what we want to know is what makes life worth living. How about positive emotion? How about meaning? How about spirituality? How about gratitude? How about accomplishment? So the intellectual idea was for psychology to have make full sense of the human condition. In many circumstances, the data are that optimistic people get depressed at only half the rate when setbacks occur, that optimistic people do better than expected on the sports field, in grades, and in many kinds of work, that optimistic people have yeastier immune systems, they're less likely to die of cardiovascular disease, and that descriptively optimistic people are generally liked better. It turns out if you take pessimistic people, depressive people, of which I'm an example, and you teach them principles of recognizing the catastrophic thoughts they're saying to themselves, this interview is going terribly, I've really lost my touch, and then arguing against it, no, Joe's been laughing and smiling at my jokes throughout, then it turns out you can make people permanently, lastingly more optimistic. The last evolutionary epoch was the Ice Ages, and the mentality that said, it's a lovely day in Philadelphia today, it'll probably be a lovely day tomorrow, got crushed by the ice. And the mentality that was a catastrophe, looks like a lovely day in Philadelphia today, but this is just superficial, and what's really coming in catastrophe is what our intellectual evolutionary forebears, the ones that survived, gave us. So we're bad weather animals, ready to see the most catastrophic. Now, that's very adaptive if you're in Bosnia during a war, or if you're living in a society in which there's death and famine and plague. One of my colleagues, Felicia Huppert, has done a massive survey of the 23 European Union nations. And she asked the question, in each of these 23 nations, what percentage of adults are flourishing? The criteria for flourishing are high amount of positive emotion, good relationships, high amount of meaning in life, high amount of engagement at work. And by those criteria, involving at least 2,000 people in every nation, 32% of Danes are flourishing, 15% of Brits are flourishing, only 5% of Russians are flourishing. What is positive psychology and well-being's long-term goal? Well, I call it 51. It is the notion that by these criteria of high positive emotion, high engagement, high meaning, good relationships, that in the year 2051, 51% of the world's population will be flourishing. Now, that's a grandiose dream, and I don't know how it will happen, but we've now been able to define the notion of flourishing. We know quite a bit about what increases positive emotion, engagement, meaning. And I think it's a great vision for the future of my science and my discipline to be part of a movement that creates vastly more flourishing around the world.
One of the forefathers or founding fathers of humanistic psychology is Alfred Adler, and he made major contributions to the field from about 1958 to 1969. And he kind of came out as a response to Freud initially. And one of the things he noted was that Freud basically said, this is how you are. And Adler was separating himself from Freud by saying that you can take who you are and grow. And he argued that we are not victims of fate, but that we can actively make choices to improve our lives. And he said that the primary human motivation is superiority in self. In other words, to constantly try to improve yourself and strive to be the best version of yourselves. What was interesting about Adler to me is that he actually had a difficult childhood, as many of the psychologists that we'll look at today did. But his brother actually died at a very young age in the bed next to him. And then Adler got extremely sick and almost died of pneumonia at the age of 4. And he said that he always felt kind of envious and inferior to his older brother, who never really suffered from illness and was always healthy and kind of thriving. And so Adler's very famous for coining the term inferiority complex, which did stem from his own feelings of inferiority towards his healthy older brother, which is something Adler's admitted to. So the inferiority complex is a problem that affects adults who have not been able to overcome the feelings of inferiority that they developed as a child. And so he says that when we come into the world as children, we're small and limited in our knowledge about the world, and the world is big, and these adults have all this power and control over us, and that makes us feel inferior. But many of us grow out of that inferior feeling, and one of the ways we do that is by having healthy parent-child relationships. But if we don't grow out of the inferior feelings that we have as children, then we tend to engage in this defense mechanism called compensation, which is where we try to overcome the feelings of inferiority in one area of life by striving to be superior in another area of life. So there's famous examples of this in history are there's a term called the Napoleon complex, which argues that Napoleon was a short man and that he felt inferior because of that. And so because of this feeling of inferiority, he tried to wage all these wars and conquer all these people. And Adler's also very famous for creating the birth order theory. And so he says that firstborn children tend to, be in the spotlight their whole life, and then the younger siblings come along and steal their attention. And so one of the things that they do is they try to get that attention back by overcompensating and becoming overachievers. And then he said that middle children feel relatively good at first. They feel kind of superior over the dethroned oldest child, like, yeah, I took your spotlight. And they dominate over their younger siblings. So to that extent, they become competitive. But there's also some, you've heard of middle child syndrome, maybe. And so there's also some kind of negative attributes of middle childhood, according to Adler as well. And then the youngest children Adler says are treated like the babies, and they're pampered and they're overprotected, and they don't get the same freedom as the older siblings. So Adler argued that the youngest children were the most likely to develop this inferiority complex. Adler did say that this inferiority complex can lead to creativity in certain ways, so it's not all bad. He also very famously coined the term social interest, which is a concept that involves identifying and empathizing with others, so that collectively we can kind of um, strive for a better future together by relating to one another. And so he says in order to gain a social interest, we have to have a community feeling, which is a sense of belonging to the ongoing development of humankind. So the next major forerunner in the humanistic movement is Carl Jung, and he was really popular in the 60s and the 70s. He coined some famous terms like age of the Aquarius, and introvert and extrovert all come from Carl Jung. But he had a pretty big celebrity following, actually. People were a big fan of Carl Jung, especially in the 60s and 70s. So his work sheds a lot of light on human development, particularly during the Middle Age. So when we're in our 30s and 40s and developing then, but it's applicable to any age, any person looking to grow. So he believed that we all have that self-actualization goal. He was on board with that. He did say that the process of self-actualization is oriented towards the future. So then we shouldn't really focus on the past too much, but instead just kind of leave that behind and keep moving forward. He also talked a lot about individuation, which is a process of moving toward a fully harmonious and integrated personality by becoming your true self and kind of separating yourself from past influences like what your family says you should be or what your parents say you should be, but by becoming the person that you actually are. And he says that this is really the primary goal of humans. And in order to achieve this goal, we must become aware of our whole self, which includes our constructive and our destructive forces. What are we doing that's helpful? What are we doing that's harmful? And then he, in regards to those destructive forces, he said that we all have a shadow side, which is the side of us that's associated with primitive impulses like selfishness and greed. It's kind of the dark side of the personality. And he said we all have it. We all have this dark side, we all have this shadow side, and we need to stop denying it, but instead take a look at it and embrace it as part of us, as sort of a yin and a yang, and learn how to manage it appropriately so that it doesn't become a destructive force in our life. And also, Jung was very famous for archetypes. And so, archetypes are these kind of symbolic representations of a person, an object, an experience. And so, if I say the word hippie, we all might have kind of the same archetype of a hippie. What does a hippie look like? How do they dress? How do they act? So we think about trees and flowers and long skirts and, that kind of stuff. And so he says that we all have these archetypes. They're part of our collective unconscious. And so those archetypes kind of influence our identity. They're kind of roles that we play. We're like actors in a way. And he says that they can be problematic because they're not our real self necessarily. So I'm a mom, and I often wonder if I have this archetype of mother, nurturing, loving, and then am I just like acting out this role of mom, or is this really who I am as a mother? So we all have these different archetypes. I also have the archetype of professor as female. And so to what extent are we just trying to fulfill what we think those roles should look like, and to what extent are we actually being ourselves? And he says that, we should try to not just act out the roles or the archetypes, but be true to who we really are. The next major figure in the development of humanistic psychology that we're going to discuss is Carl Rogers. He founded the person-centered approach, which is used in therapy and in medicine today. and was an influential figure in revolutionizing the direction of counseling theory and practice. So, the person centered approach is about allowing the person to kind of discover themselves and discover their own issues and come up with solutions to their problems on their own. And the way that he achieves success in this therapy format is by showing people empathy, by truly listening to them, by showing them what he calls unconditional positive regard, which is kind of like loving them unconditionally. It's an attitude of acceptance and respect on the part of the therapist or the observer, no matter what a person says or does. And he says that we all really need this unconditional positive regard, that it's a great thing for us and that we can achieve it through real friends or trusted family or therapists. And when we have this unconditional positive regard, this is when we are really able to grow and develop more realistic self concepts and become what he says is a fully functioning person. So, a fully functioning person, according to Carl Rogers, is a person who is completely authentic, completely themselves, has a very fulfilled life, has found meaning, and they're an effective person. And so, in order to become fully functioning, they have to reflect and ask basic questions like, who am I? And really gain that type of sense of self-awareness with being able to shed their ego as being a major component in succeeding at that. And so he also says that becoming a fully functioning person is about giving up the facade and accepting who you are so you can move forward. So what he's talking about when he's talking about the facade is this idea that we all have a real self, which is the perceptions of your actual characteristics, traits, and abilities. And then we have our ideal self, which is the perceptions of who we should be or who we would like to be. And he argues that the closer these two things match, the less anxiety we have, the more harmony we have in our life, and the more likely to be fully functioning. But if we have a distorted view of our real self or an unattainable ideal self, then this can cause a mismatch, which can cause a lot of anxiety and make it really difficult to grow and develop as a person. So here we have Abraham Maslow, and he was one of the most influential psychologists to contribute to our understanding of self-actualizing individuals. He built on Adler's and Jung's works in some significant ways, yet he really distinguished himself in discovering a psychology of health. So he kind of was able to integrate the idea of the mind with health, mental health, and even physical health to some extent. So in contrast to Freud, Maslow felt that too much research was being done on anxiety and hostility and neurosis, and he thought if we only studied the sick, then a sick psychology would prevail. He reportedly had a tough childhood and family life. His mom was mean, he said, and his dad was uninterested in him. He was embarrassed by his appearance. He particularly disliked his large nose and scrawny figure. And so he kind of turned to books to compensate for what he perceived to be unattractiveness with knowledge. And so Maslow researched the psychology of health and self-actualization and then developed this hierarchy, which we'll talk about now, which is one of the most famous concepts in psychology, and I've had students tell me that they've seen it in their business classes and their anthropology classes. So it's widely used and respected. And the idea behind the hierarchy is that you have to complete one level before you can move to the next. And it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in other words, you have to have your needs met at one level before you can move to the next level. All right, so here's the hierarchy of needs. And so at the bottom, we have our basic human needs, our physiological needs, which include water, warmth, rest, food. And he says that if those needs are not met, then we're not able to kind of move up the hierarchy and move to a higher level of needs and work on our growth in that type of way. So it makes sense. I mean, I know that if I'm like really hungry, it's hard for me to focus on anything, or if I'm super tired or cold, or if any of my physiological needs aren't met, it's difficult to kind of move to the next level. And then after that, we have the safety level. And in the safety level, we're looking for security and safety. And we need that physically primarily, but we also need it emotionally, financially. So if we live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of violence, we might not feel particularly secure and safe. If we live in a home where there's domestic abuse going on, if we're struggling financially, all of these things might not make us feel very safe, and so then we might act in a certain way to get those safety needs met. We might search out a new place to live, or figure out how to get out of a bad relationship. And then once we have those needs met, we can move to the next level, which is belonging and love needs. And so once we feel that we are secure and safe and stable, then Maslow argues that we start looking for groups to belong to, whether that be school or church or social groups, hanging out with other people that like to skateboard or smoke weed or whatever it is. We look for something to belong to. And then we also start looking for love needs. And he means, of course, intimate romantic relationships, but also intimacy in just terms of feeling a connectedness and a bondedness with someone, really feeling like there's someone, whether it be a friend or a cousin or a romantic partner, that really gets you, that really understands who you are and sees you in that kind of avatar, I see you type of way. And then after we have those needs met, so we'll behave in such a way to try to achieve the belonging and love needs. And then after we have those needs met, then we can move up, then we naturally move up to the esteem needs. And this is where we feel that, we strive to gain a feeling of accomplishment in whatever is important to us. Maybe that's just education, maybe that's growing a garden, or maybe it's having some sort of status in your community, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a philanthropist, but some way of really feeling a sense of meaning and purpose and feeling good about the person that you are. And then the tip top of the hierarchy here is self-actualization, which we've been talking about. And this is when a person realizes their full potential and is kind of like fully functioning, as Carl Rogers talked about. And so Abraham Maslow says that before we can become self-actualized, which he also states is a very difficult thing to achieve and that not very many people do, but in order to become self-actualized, we have to satisfy our higher need, or the lower needs first, the physiological, safety, belonging, and esteem needs. And so the authors of your book talk about the idea that self-actualization is grounded in individualism, which is a Western concept that really affirms the uniqueness, autonomy, freedom, and intrinsic worth of the individual, and emphasizes personal responsibility for one's behavior and well-being. And this is contrasted with the idea of collectivism, which we see more in like Eastern cultures, which is preserving and enhancing the well-being of a group, and that being valued over individual autonomy. And collectivism really emphasizes unity and unification, integration, and fusion. And so I agree with the authors of the book. They say that we can integrate both individualism and collectivism into our growth process. We can try to become self-actualized and maintain other esteem, as we talked about earlier, and find a balance between caring for ourselves and caring for others. And hopefully in doing that, we will be successful on this journey of personal growth, and maybe even some of us will become self-actualized. Okay, so what I want you to do for lecture activity 2 is open up that document that you had for saved for your first lecture activity, and just go ahead and add to it below where you did lecture activity 1. Label this number 2 for lecture activity 2, and go ahead and title it self-test. And then what you're going to do is read the statements here on the slide and write down the numbers that apply to you. So if you feel like 1 and 2 apply to you, or 2 and 5 apply to you, go ahead and write down whichever of these statements you agree with, or you can apply to your own life. You feel like they're true for you. Okay, so now that you've done that, I've put up a new slide that shows you what each statement represents. So these were different kind of levels of the hierarchy, so to speak. So if you put down a 1, it means that you have your esteem needs met. If you put down a 2, it means that you feel like you have your belonging and love needs met. 3 are your self-actualization needs. 4 are your physiological or biological needs. And then 5 are your safety needs. So you can kind of see which ones of those you met, and if you skipped around on the hierarchy, or if you're kind of meeting like the bottom 3 but not the top 2, or whatever it is. And so not everyone agrees with the hierarchy 100%. There are people that say you don't have to go in the order of the levels, that you can skip around, that you can move up, you can go back down. But at any rate, I'd like for you to go ahead and tell me if you agree with those results. So on that document, just give me 1 or 2 sentences. First give me agree or disagree with the results, and then 1 or 2 sentences on why you agree. If you agree, I agree that I have my esteem needs met because I always wanted to do X, and that's exactly what I'm doing, or whatever. So give me a couple of sentences on that. And then that'll be it for lecture activity 2. So don't forget to save that, because you're going to have to turn it in to Moodle. All right, so let's look at some of the core concepts of self-actualizers. Self-actualizers have self-awareness. So they are more aware of themselves, of others, and of reality. They see reality as it is. They have an ability to kind of detect phoniness or fakeness in people. They avoid seeing things in preconceived categories, so those archetypes that we talked about earlier. They kind of think for themselves. They know right and wrong. They have a sense of inner direction. They avoid pressure from others. And they perceive life in a fresh way, like children. They're really in the moment, and they are fascinated by the little things. My daughter's 2 at the time I'm recording this video, and if she sees a bug on the floor, it's like we have to stop, and she has to stare at it, and we watch it, and we talk about it. Or if it's has rained and there's puddles on the ground, she has to jump in every puddle, and just sheer delight is written all over her face. And so we see that in people that are self-actualizers and have self-awareness. They stay in the moment, they're present, and they appreciate life in kind of a fresh way. And then self-aware people that are self-actualizers, part of their self-awareness brings these things that psychologists call peak moments. And so what these are defined as is moments of pure joy and being one with the universe. And I've heard them described as when you just like feel as if you're hitting on all cylinders. Just everything is feeling connected and meaningful and purposeful, and all your needs are met. And in extreme cases, I've heard people talk about these peak moments as like almost an out-of-body experience, or a feeling of being high on drugs, although they haven't taken drugs. It's just their natural state of being. And then another core concept of self-actualizers is the sense of freedom. They sort of have a detachment from the rigors of society and societal norms and the day-to-day, burn of existence. And they have a lot of creativity. They have spontaneity. Another core concept is a basic honesty and caring. They have a sense of social interest. They really do care about other people and they empathize with other people. They really want to feel what it feels like to be in that person's shoes and really listen to others and really try to understand and relate. They have interpersonal relationships that are meaningful and deeply connected and intimate. Usually, self actualizers have a good sense of humor. They kind of get the cosmic joke, so to speak, that we're all sort of taking ourselves way too seriously. And then trust and autonomy. So they have a search for purpose and meaning. They're individuals, so they have a sense of independence and autonomy. They're self governing and they have a true acceptance of themselves and others. Not necessarily everything that someone else does, but an acceptance that, we're all here on earth and we're all flawed and we're all trying. Um, and, accepting that what people do is what they did, and not trying to change someone else, but letting someone else change on their own if they want. So those are the core concepts of self-actualizers. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about today are Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. And so while we said that intelligence is not a factor that is closely associated with happiness, it is still a part of self-awareness, kind of learning where your intelligence lies. And so for years, Francis Galton had taught us that IQ is the way to measure intelligence. So you just kind of sum everyone's intelligence up with one number, like, oh, Joe's an 80, uh, Mary's 110 on the IQ. But recently, relatively recently, psychologists like Howard Gardner have said, that's not like an accurate way to investigate intelligence. Intelligence is dynamic and complex. And also, it doesn't really matter how smart a person is. What matters is how a person is smart. And so Howard Gardner kind of investigated that idea and discovered that there are 8 different types of intelligences. And so the first one is verbal linguistic. And this is a person who is very intelligent when it comes to words, vocabulary words. That's what their brain responds to. Reading, writing, telling stories. They think in words rather than pictures. And so the way that you are intelligent also affects how you learn best. So you can kind of learn in a way that speaks to your intelligence or coincides with it or helps it out. So if you are a verbal linguistic learner, then learning is really facilitated by opportunities to listen or to speak or to write. And then the next type is math logical. And so logical mathematical intelligence are people who, get numbers. They understand reasoning and logic, philosophy, problem solving, science, math, and they're a person who learns best by classifying information, engaging in abstract thinking, and looking for common basic principles. The next one is spatial intelligence. Spatial intelligent people tend to be really good at art. They're also called visual spatial learners. And they're a person who learns best by seeing pictures and graphically mapping out material to learn rather than relying mainly on listening to lectures. And then the next one that we're going to talk about is the bodily kinesthetic intelligence. And so this is a person who's usually athletic, dancing. They kind of need to learn to move. They are really good with their body in terms of having good balance, good coordination, things like that. And you could tell if you're a bodily kinesthetic person if you tap your foot a lot or move your hands around a lot when you're talking. And so we often say that bodily kinesthetic learners need to move to think. And so this is really a person who learns by doing, by getting physically involved through movement and action. And so this is like a hands-on learner is kind of the best way for them to retain information. And then the next one is a musical rhythmic learner. And this is a person who learns best through melody and music. Generally, they're really good at picking up sounds in songs. They can hear the drum beat. They can, versus hearing the guitar in the song. They easily remember melodies. They tend to be composers, singers, rappers, anything having to do with music. And then the next one is interpersonal learner. And these are people who are people smart. They're really good at understanding other people and relating to other people. And so they learn best by relating, sharing, and participating in group assignments. And then we have intrapersonal intelligence. And these are people who kind of have a natural inclination towards self awareness. They understand themselves. Um, they learn best by engaging in independent study projects rather than working on things in groups. They like to reflect a lot. They like to have their own space and be able to kind of do things on their own time, and that's where they really thrive. And then the last one is the naturalistic learner or naturalistic intelligence. And this is like your Bear Grylls, Survivor Man, um, people who are like really good at Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, camping. So these are people that understand nature. They can see the patterns in nature. Um, they are good at identifying and classifying objects and understanding like natural and human made systems. So they really learn best through exploring and being outside, being around plants and other kind of natural events. So just being in nature is really where their brain lights up and is able to retain the most information. Okay, so for our third lecture activity, go ahead and label that document that you have opened or running. Label it Multiple Intelligences Test. And I'm going to have you take the test. I'm going to give you a website to take the test at. And then I'd like for you to go ahead and write down on your document for number 3 where you just put Multiple Intelligences Test. I'd like for you to write down your results. What did it say you were strongest in? Some people are strong in one, some people are strong in a couple of them. And so write down maybe your top 2 or 3, and then tell me if you agree or disagree and why. So if it says you're a naturalistic learner, tell me like I don't agree with that. I never go outside. Or if it says like you're interpersonal, and you do agree, tell me that you're really interested in maybe becoming a counselor and you're always kind of the glue that holds your groups of friends or your family together. So just take the test, write down your results, and then tell me if you agree or disagree and why. And so that will be all of the lecture activities for Chapter 1 are those 3, and you will need to upload them to Moodle for credit this week. And that's all I have for you for Chapter 1. So we will see you on the next chapter. And here is the website that you're going to go to take the test. Okay, see you next time.